This is the third episode. My guest is Max Blumenthal. He's the founder and senior editor of The Gray Zone, which you can read at thegrayzone.com, correct?
Yep.
Okay. And he's also the author of four books, Republican Gomorrah, Goliath, The 51-Day War, and most recently, The Management of Savagery, which I'm going to plug right here quickly because y'all should read this. And along with the journalist Dan Cohen, Max has also made the film Killing Gaza, which is an in-depth examination of Israel's genocidal war on Gaza in 2014, as well as the aftermath of that war. And I believe your most recent piece is up in the Chicago Reader, correct?
Yeah. I did
Okay.
two pieces on the prison situation in the Chicago area, which is now a hotspot of coronavirus.
Okay. All right, Max, thanks so much for taking the time to talk. I appreciate it. So my first question would be in the context of coronavirus, which is obviously a global pandemic. What is happening with regard to sanctions on Iran and Venezuela? It seems like U.S. sanctions on those countries are getting more brutal by the day, despite the fact that they also have to deal with the same pandemic that we do.
Yeah. The Trump administration really doesn't want to let up on sanctions. I have a cat-related situation at the start of the interview.
Okay.
Get out of here. I mean, the Trump administration is obviously using the sanctions as an opportunity to ramp up its maximum pressure campaign on Iran. Iran is, become one of the world's hotspots, and has had like a pretty terrible, time in preventing deaths. It has to do with the fact that sanctions were ramped up after the Trump administration broke the Iran deal and Iran started pivoting east to China. And the city of Qom became one of the major areas for cooperation between Chinese officials, Chinese technical experts, and Iran. And so the virus spread from China to Qom, and Qom became a major hotspot. Talking to friends in Iran, they tell me, there isn't hoarding. The situation is sort of being managed, but there have been, thousands of deaths. We don't know how many. U.S. media mocked Iran for mass graves, but now we're actually seeing mass graves in New York. And
Yeah.
there's been no attempt. I mean, Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, has called for a global ceasefire and specifically emphasized ending sanctions to allow the world to come together to treat coronavirus. But in Iran, with the Trump administration, they're just obviously completely ignoring this. Um, but what we're seeing is the resilience of countries like Iran that have dealt with sanctions since 1979 and have developed their own mechanisms for public health care, for getting medical care into communities through community organizations that are connected to the government. That's also true in Venezuela. Venezuela is facing a medieval siege under the Trump administration. Yet it has the lowest contagion rate in all of Latin America. That has a lot to do with the community brigades, the colectivos that are constantly demonized as kind of like paramilitary gangs for Nicolas Maduro. Um, Venezuela has actually been able, also through the partnership, what it calls the civil military partnership, to really lock down the country and still continue to get food to people through the CLAP food program, which is a program that provides food basically for free, along with sanitary supplies to, um, I think, 6 million families, which is a substantial part of the Venezuelan population. And this is a program that the Trump administration has attempted to sanction. But I've seen it in action, and I've seen the way they get into hard to reach, really impoverished communities and get the essentials to people. So this really shows a functional government. I think Venezuela would be in a catastrophic shape if someone like Juan Guaido had taken over and all of the connections and communal bonds, as well as the um, governmental capacity had been broken down. And if you want to look at an alternative, just take a look at what's happening in Honduras, where now there are scores and scores of death. I think it has one of the highest death rates or the highest death rate in Central America. The president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, is a U.S. vassal, a complete U.S. puppet. The U.S. is looking the other way, even though a federal court in New York State has indicted Hernandez or named him as a co-conspirator in the indictment of his brother, Tony Hernandez, for drug trafficking. He's basically running a narco regime, and they've tried to lock down the country. We've seen video of them firing tear gas into markets, attacking people on the street, and basically using the pandemic as a pretext to shut down what was a national uprising that had been raging for months, because this is a guy who stole an election and was governing illegitimately. So you can really see the contrast between Venezuela and a country like Honduras. You can also look, we have a piece up that went up 2 days ago on the Gray Zone by Ben Norton, who's in Managua right now, on Nicaragua's response. Now, just look at the coverage of Nicaragua in the Washington Post, which is basically an arm of the Nicaraguan right-wing opposition. And they're mocking the response in Nicaragua, saying they've declined to confront a pandemic. They've speculated that Daniel Ortega, the elected president of Nicaragua, was dead. He just came out tonight and delivered a pretty fiery stem winder of a presidential address calling for global cooperation, warning that the pandemic doesn't stop at borders, and calling for support for the World Health Organization and attacking empire. So he's clearly very much alive. But beyond that, Nicaragua also has a very low infection rate. It's been very competent in handling the virus, and it has something that we in the U.S. don't have. It has free public health care, and it's
Mm-hmm.
the second poorest country in Latin America. That is the legacy of the Sandinistas. And you don't hear anyone talking about the lack of public health care on CNN or MSNBC. They're just talking about Trump being a big bad orange jerk face. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the reality on the ground in Latin America is really turning the American exceptionalist viewpoint on its head. And these are countries that are successfully, so far, I don't know how it'll turn out, but so far successfully combating coronavirus while under US sanctions, while facing US sieges. And the important thing to understand about sanctions is while the US says that they don't affect the people, they're not sanctioning civilians, what they do, and they explicitly aim to do, is starve countries like Venezuela of assets, preventing them from selling their oil on the world market. And if you don't have assets, then you can't purchase medical supplies. You can't purchase the food to feed the poor. And so it actually has had that effect, along with completely destroying Venezuela's economy, Iran's economy. U.S. sanctions have taken 1/4 of Iran's oil fields offline. So there is a terrible effect. Um, so yeah, and another perfect example of how sanctions affect entities that actually help people, common people, is that a Russian company was producing the ventilators that Russia delivered in an emergency supply to New York. This Russian company that was producing the ventilators had been sanctioned by Barack Obama in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's saving New Yorkers now. I mean, that's the ultimate irony.
Yeah, for sure. What's the name of that company?
I don't know the name of the company. It's actually the holding company of the company that was sanctioned, but Reuters reported this about a week and a half ago, and it was sanctioned by Obama after Putin annexed Crimea.
Okay. Okay. So I guess just dovetailing off of that, perhaps we could talk. a little bit about the U.S.'s response versus China's response uh, to the pandemic. As you just noted, we're in the richest, supposedly most powerful country in the world, and you know, Russia, who's supposed to be our demonic foe, is helping us with ventilators because we don't have enough. And then you look at Wuhan, where China was able to quickly contain the virus within the borders of the city, and it's all but gone now. So um, I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit. Why you think the U.S.'s response was so derelict.
Well, I think we're told that China's response was derelict. And it may
Right.
be that they did not respond adequately for 2 or 3 weeks when they were trying to figure out just exactly what this virus was. Many people thought it was SARS. The supposed whistleblower, Dr. Lee, what's his name? Dr. Li Wenyang, he was running around saying that it was SARS. He wasn't even an epidemiologist or a viral specialist. He was an ophthalmologist, and he was punished for spreading false information. But it was at a time of confusion and fear. He was punished by local authorities, and ultimately, once the sort of national authorities entered the fray, and Xi started taking the situation seriously, China had the capacity and the national will to really take this on. I really think socialism is a factor here. The state was able to guide companies. They were able to seize factories and order them to produce masks, order them to produce medical supplies and ventilators. They were able to mobilize doctors from across the country. What we're seeing now from the Trump administration is one of the biggest sort of free market shams in history, one of the most dangerous, called Operation Airbridge, where basically five gigantic medical supply companies are running around the world as agents, bidding in cash for medical gear, then bringing it to the US, and then the states are forced to bid with these giant corporations, these medical companies, for gear they need to save people's lives. And so many governors are actually bailing out of this ridiculous program, which is overseen by Trump and his completely unqualified son-in-law, Jared Kushner,
Hmm.
because it just what the Trump administration could be doing is just simply have FEMA buy up all of those medical supplies and then give it to states according to need. Actually, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, used that language, and that's socialist language, to
Hmm.
each according to his need. So what they need to do is a little bit of socialism, and the government here, I mean, obviously being run by Trump, but I assume a Democrat would be still letting the market guide the situation more than it should be. But Trump is just letting the market take over, and it's killing
Hmm.
people. I mean, he has blood on his hands for this. And then it took months and months, weeks after I knew a pandemic was coming. It took the Trump administration months to take it really seriously. It was, I think, March 13th when the NBA canceled its season and when serious measures started to be taken. But that was just way after this virus was present. And I think
Hmm.
part of it has to do with the way the American public is conditioned, where it's completely reactive. Every policy that the public demands, from gun control to free healthcare, it comes in reaction to a crisis, and not because they understand what's needed ahead of time. They're not proactive because corporate media, it doesn't report on actual crises that real people are facing. Just think about corporate media coverage leading up in the weeks leading up to this crisis. It was all about impeachment, about a
Hmm.
phony, arms deal to Ukraine. Nobody could even figure out what was going on in the impeachment theater, who these random characters, Vindman, were. And then, you were supposed to stand up and cheer for Vindman, according to Biden. Just all of these fake issues. Nancy Pelosi was tweeting about Trump being controlled by Russia in January as the um, pandemic was a national epidemic for China, and it was traveling from Wuhan into Western Europe. I mean, there were cases cropping up around Western Europe. So there was no seriousness across the political class, across corporate media. The whole thing wasn't taken seriously. And so it's pretty ridiculous to expect that Donald Trump was going to be proactive. But then once he realized this was likely going to be declared a pandemic, his first impulse was to calm down the markets.
Mm-hmm.
I always said Donald Trump is the apotheosis of a failed elite. It's the apotheosis of American empire. He's not sort of this, he's not this unique figure in American history. He's really one of the truest reflections of the ugliest components of American life. And in trying to calm the markets, or in the way that we see the stimulus package play out, where the Fed is just printing endless money in order to keep the Dow Jones Industrial up while the public is getting completely fleeced. People are dying and the economy is collapsing and the unemployment rate is surging above 10%. That really shows you something not just about Trump, but something about just good old fashioned American exploitation. So I think when we look at the difference between the US response and China, we're looking at just two completely opposite states. China, in many ways, is like the post-war U.S., which was embracing Keynesianism, putting money into industries, putting money into the public sector in order to build what ultimately became American empire. China's doing that right now. It's lifted close to 1 billion people out of poverty. It's almost single-handedly responsible for the growth of the global middle class. Whereas in the US, the people who benefited the most from the post-war boom are dying in an opioid crisis. Their lifespans are declining for the first time. US empire is shrinking. The walls are closing in. And as the walls are closing in, we're seeing, I think, the most infantile reaction to the pandemic in the bipartisan desire to blame China. It's not just Trump who's doing it by calling it the Wuhan virus or the China virus or the CCP virus. We're seeing it even from like left-wing media and Twitter personalities. Just this infantile reaction because they can't cope with the fact, number one, that China is a rising power that is a check on US hegemony, that a new global system is coming into play, and they simply can't accept that cooperation is necessary. This entire generation, I don't know how old you are, but I'm 42. For my whole
37.
Life, 37.
I turned 37 on Monday.
The same for you.
Last Monday.
We've never heard a leader of our country use the word peace or talk about global cooperation. Actually, the last time I heard that, it was from Ronald Reagan during the SALT 1 and 2 negotiations with Gorbachev, and it was because he sensed that the Cold War was ending and the Soviet Union was going to collapse. So in his mind, a U.S. victory was on the horizon. But we don't hear about peace or cooperation. We don't have leaders. Even Bernie Sanders, he didn't say this virus doesn't distinguish between Chinese, Russian, Venezuelan, Iranian, or American people. We all need to work together against this silent killer. It just wasn't in his heart to say that, and no one was pushing him to say that. I've said it before, the closest we came to that, and the only candidate who said anything like that was a minor candidate, Tulsi Gabbard, sort of demonized by a lot of Bernie supporters. So here we are having this infantile response to what was a uniquely American failure.
Yeah, and it's what's ironic about it too, or maybe just grotesque, is that Trump is calling on GM now to manufacture these ventilators, and it almost seems like this last ditch effort to reinvigorate American manufacturing, beyond just the weapons industry. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know if you watched the coronavirus task force conference that they had earlier today. It was
No,
at
I missed the past
5:30.
three, which
Okay.
which apparently means I missed some of the best ones.
Yeah, well, yeah, today was pretty good. Trump called it short because he was cold. Uh, he actually said that, it's cold out here. I'm going inside. Um, but what was probably most bizarre about it is that they had two TV screens, like two flat screens, flanking him, and sort of in the middle of his, you know, I think he was actually reading off a script this time, and his hair was gray, oddly, and he sounded sick. Uh, I'm not, making any inferences, but it was a kind of bizarre appearance. But anyway, on these screens, they played a commercial from GM about, all the, supposedly heroic manufacturing they're doing to provide ventilators and perhaps other equipment to uh, healthcare providers. It was pure spectacle, very bizarre, and I guess that brings me to this point of the Sanders campaign. This was kind of like a moment where Bernie Sanders, who's been advocating for Medicare for all for so long, really could have taken the helm and said, this is exactly why we need Medicare for all, because of this horrendous response we're witnessing right now. And then on top of that, I think he was very weak foreign policy wise. Um, but what are your thoughts on his campaign and how it ended up?
Well, just first a thought on Trump's coronavirus task force briefings. It's the way that we see them reported or covered seems to be totally different from the reality of them, especially and the reality that so many Americans experience. Um, I know Trump's approval rating is falling, but it went up initially when the crisis began. And, Jim Acosta said Trump had the worst meltdown in history. I haven't watched the full interaction, but I watched some of it, and it looked to me like Trump was just insulting and running circles around reporters who might have been asking salient questions, but the way a lot of the public experiences it is just they hate the media and they want this guy to beat up on them,
Hmm.
uh, and that things might turn out a lot differently than we think, as they did in 2016 at the end of this. And meanwhile, Biden is nowhere to be found and won't be found anywhere. We're just never going to experience Biden. He's been a terrible politician my whole life. And now he seems to be mentally enfeebled and physically confined. So it's a pretty bad combination. Bernie Sanders, you know, he disappointed and at the same time he fulfilled my expectations. I always saw him as kind of a mediocre figure who was just but nevertheless really decent, decent enough to run against Hillary Clinton, decent enough to run again to give a lot of abandoned young people a voice, but not very charismatic. He didn't have the instinct to fight Joe Biden or to actually take on what a lot of Bernie supporters like to call the establishment, but which really is the capitalist system in all its various forms. And especially on foreign policy, Bernie Sanders he didn't really pay much attention to it over his career. He did some noble things in the 1980s at the last phase of the Cold War, which were popular at the time, like the Sister Cities program with the Soviet Union,
Hmm.
solidarity with the Sandinistas. This was sort of mainstream and even within the kind of liberal world in Washington, D.C., but especially in Vermont. That was just, kind of a mainstream thing. And it shows you how far we've fallen and how right wing this country has become, how neoconservative it's become, that Bernie Sanders could actually be attacked within the Democratic Party for those initiatives.
Hmm.
But he really was defensive throughout the campaign about his past when he could have been branding Biden as a warmonger who personally transformed Ukraine into the poorest country in Europe. They didn't want to touch Ukraine, which I think was one of Biden's weakest points, one of the biggest scandals. I guess he didn't want to seem pro-Russian. Russiagate really made it difficult for
Mm-hmm.
Bernie Sanders to have any latitude, and he didn't want to take that on. He didn't. He just, you needed someone who's more energetic, maybe like Trump, even though malevolent and hateful, who really, really felt this fiery disgust and hatred of the system to really take it on head on. And it would have emboldened Bernie's base. They were waiting for something like that. He didn't give it to them, and he did what I expected. Within his campaign, there were people that I, came up with, who I've known for years, who come from the activist world, who come from the anti-war community, who I really respect. But I feel like they were kind of overwhelmed by the kind of political professionals, the think tankers who come from the Beltway blob, and his foreign policy team eventually became defined by people who might have sort of a realist perspective on the world, but aren't anti-war and do see themselves working back in the think tank world after the campaign is over, and even working on the Biden campaign. The National Interest reported yesterday that the Biden's campaign has offered Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisors the opportunity to work on the campaign. So if you actually think about the people who were advising Bernie on foreign policy, do you think they were going to tell him to take on Biden as a warmonger, to take on the foreign policy establishment itself, to call it the permanent war state, to really launch these incendiary attacks that so many people, including so many veterans, are just dying for? No, because they want to protect their own bottom line and make sure there are job opportunities if the campaign fails, as they kind of helped make as they helped make it do. Um, and that's also true for a lot of the kind of so-called democratic socialist influencers around the Bernie campaign, who really yearn for New York Times bylines or want Guardian columns. They don't want to take on the fake news media and attack corporate media as the enemy of the people that it is. They want to work for it. So, the forces that really wanted a confrontation, a revolutionary confrontation, were overwhelmed by this kind of professional class. And Bernie himself didn't have the fight in him. He also didn't have the fight in him to do the one most important thing I think he could have done, which is to attack Barack Obama and his legacy, to really interrogate Barack Obama's legacy again and again. Obama was the paper tiger that Bernie needed to take out in order to succeed, just as Trump took out the Bush family in one fell swoop. And, Trump attacking the Bush family, it fell on very fertile soil, but Bernie was afraid to do it.
Yeah, and one has to wonder if there's uh, a race component to that. A fear of
Absolutely.
being labeled a racist for attacking the first and only black president we've had. Um,
Yeah.
but
Didn't work out too well for him in South Carolina anyway. I mean, he got even, I think he performed even more poorly among black voters than he did in 2016. So what do you have to lose?
yeah, um, so I guess just as we wrap up here, what's your take on Ocasio-Cortez recently? Basically voting, what would it be? Was it yes for the stimulus package or no? I forget what her vote was. Jimmy Dore did a piece on this that was quite good.
Yeah.
But and you and I talked about this last summer about her sort of being this charlatan of a progressive. Um, and then on top of that, you have Tulsi Gabbard, not only dropping out of the race but endorsing Joe Biden, who uh, supported the war that she fought in and was ostensibly running against. What do you? What's your take on these people? I mean, are they just careerists? Are they just opportunists? Or do they just not have you know the moral compass that they present themselves as having?
they're definitely weird people I find unrelatable. Um, Politicians in general, but particularly ones who really angle for national stardom. I just can't imagine wanting to be in their shoes and really enjoying it. Um, and to want to be president, you have to be sort of psychotic.
Hmm.
Just can't understand the impulse to want to be president of the United States. But yeah, you pitched a piece to me on AOC like a year ago or last summer, and I thought, you were right, or you were in the right ballpark, but we needed more details to really come out and call her a charlatan. And it was almost as difficult as trying to vet Barack Obama's record back in 2008. She's a similar figure to Obama in that she sort of comes from nowhere and has been vaulted to national stardom. But I think the key is that she's been vaulted to national stardom with a nudge from people like Nancy Pelosi, who have incredibly powerful networks, um, and that they trust that she can be domesticated, and she kind of has been. Um, as for the vote on the stimulus package, yeah, she did her performance on the House floor, condemning it, and everything she said about it was correct and righteous. But it's, I think Jimmy Dore really conclusively proved that she did not vote against it.
Hmm.
There was a voice vote, and all you could hear was one guy who was obviously Thomas Massey, the libertarian from Kentucky, going, "No." They call him Mr. No.
Yeah.
There was no, I mean, you would have heard her kind of mousy voice saying, "No," you would have heard it, and you just didn't hear it. And she was there in the building, and I think she probably wanted to vote against it personally, but she didn't want to take on Nancy Pelosi and be that person. Another thing she could have done was join with Thomas Massey to force everyone to record their vote as the
Hmm.
Constitution requires. Massey, she didn't want to be demonized by everyone in Washington. Massey was called un-American for doing that. It was unbelievable. And to hell with, like, fuck these people. Like, they all wanted to get out of town as soon as possible when the rest of us had to shelter in place, and they're the ones who are supposed to represent us, that were elected and paid to be there, and they didn't even want to vote. I mean, I've never seen a bigger dereliction of responsibility. Now Nancy
Hmm.
Pelosi's home in San Francisco. I've seen her house. It's like a very stately mansion, and she's showing off on a late night show that she has 15 kinds of ice cream delivered to her to help her, kind of like to soothe her during quarantine. That's what we're dealing with. AOC, I don't know where she is, but she's not going to lead a democratic socialist revolution. It's just not going to happen. She's going to be a major player in the Democratic Party. She's sort of like Obama 2.0, because, politics
Hmm.
has moved so much, and young people have become so disillusioned that they need her to maintain the kind of hold the Democratic Party has over them. And then as for Tulsi Gabbard, I mean, I thought she ran a historic and noble campaign. It wasn't perfect, obviously. I didn't agree with her on everything. She made some bizarre statements, truly bizarre statements about, George W. Bush, and we need to overcome our partisan differences. And I think she was pulled, and there were so many contradictions about her, but she brought out the issues that are so important, and I think that are most important, should be most important to anyone concerned with building socialism in the U.S. Not that I'm saying that's my agenda, but she trained her sights on American empire and regime change wars, and you're not going to have socialism in the U.S. or democratic socialism or anything remotely resembling it as long as the U.S. is this global empire that's
Hmm.
obsessed with encircling Russia and China and fighting all these proxy wars. It's just not going to happen. So I think she, helped breathe fresh air into the debates, and they kicked her off the stage. And at the end, she was so derided and denigrated by so many people, um, that when she came to offer Bernie her endorsement as a former board member of Sanders for America in 2016, it looked like the Bernie campaign rejected her endorsement. And at the same time, she had been called a Russian Trojan horse who was going to run third party by Hillary Clinton. So the move she made, like the fuck you move, was to endorse Joe Biden and just to say fuck
Hmm.
you to all the Bernie people and Hillary Clinton. That's just my kind of reading of it. I
Hmm.
tried reaching out to people in the campaign to figure out what exactly was going on, and I never could get a clear or believable response. So that's my theory. But yeah, I mean, you can't. The thing about Tulsi Gabbard is like I never put my faith in her. I
Hmm.
never placed her above criticism or venerated her. So, but that's what so many people did with Bernie Sanders, and they wound up really setting themselves up for disappointment or anger, or you know, they've put them they've forced their own opinions into a kind of Procrustean bed where they have to always meet Bernie Sanders wherever he is when he's not your friend. He's probably doesn't have like that many friends. He's probably like a tough guy to get along with, but like, he did a decent thing and he's going to probably go back to Vermont and that's it.
Hmm.
I don't
Yeah.
know who's going to be next. Honestly, I don't see that much hope for, electoral politics in the U.S. and the people that I'd really be aware of. I actually don't feel a lot of interest among, you know, left wing young people right now in the election period. There isn't anything happening. There won't be conventions. So I would really beware of people who came out of the Bernie campaign or were some of the online influencers around it who are really complaining that Biden isn't taking them seriously enough or really moving in their direction because that's not the way to go right now. I think we need to we need to look at ways of organizing that don't ebb and flow with different elections or due to different conditions. There needs to be more of a permanent organizational base, and it needs to be focused on helping to bring in a new kind of more humane global order where powerful countries can actually work together against pandemics, and where U.S. empire actually faces some serious checks and balances.
Hmm. Well said. All right. Well,
What do you what do
we'll
you
wrap.
what do you have to say about AOC since we last explored that?
Um, I can say, I'll say that I'm not surprised at all by where she's ended up. Um, I I don't like making predictions. Um, Oftentimes you end up looking foolish, but I just had an intuition that she would become an Obama style disappointment, and I could see it. Her first vote, I think it was January 3 of 2019. It was in favor of continuing to fund and expand NATO. So this is someone who's running on a progressive platform and voting for one of the most hideous pro-war coalitions in the world. So I had
Yeah.
strong intuitions from there, but um, I don't think that everything she's done is bad or has been in bad faith, but I think, like you were saying earlier, she's been subsumed by the system and hasn't been able to resist the sort of like limelight that comes with being this new firebrand Democrat who's really just establishment. Uh,
Yeah, I mean,
it's
I
hard
don't
to.
think that I don't think that opposing NATO is even within her frame of reference. Like she wouldn't even
Mhm.
know why it should be opposed. And then if she did, she would realize the consequences are that's the end. You're not on like you're not like goofing off on daytime TV anymore. People are like,
Yeah.
what happened to AOC? She's insane. And you know, I think that's what they were preparing for when she came in. Like, oh, she's a socialist, but no,
Hmm.
no. And Ben Norton also reported for us on how sanctions on Nicaragua were introduced in Congress by, the usual Cuban American members of Congress from both parties, and there was no debate. There was just absolutely no debate.
Hmm.
Um, Not one member of Congress ever even considers to debate sanctions. So, when somebody jumps up out of nowhere to debate these, uh, to start a debate on a bill that no media is focused on, but which threatens lives of people who are immiserated in the global south, then we'll know there's someone who's actually willing to put up resistance. Because the biggest problem in Washington, as far as I can see it, the most dangerous component of Washington isn't the polarization we always hear about, it's the consensus around empire.
Hmm. Which largely has its base, I think, in the national security state and this sort of like Obama, Clinton, and even Bush status quo, that we've been
Yeah,
living under for decades.
the steady
Uh,
state.
yeah. The steady state, uh, buffered by the deep state, I guess you would say. Um,
Yeah, look up
but
the steady state. There's a website called the Steady State, that's attached to Biden's campaign, and it's people who come out of the national security state and the intelligence services who are endorsing Biden publicly.
interesting. I will look that up. And I'm not surprised that they're doing that.
Yeah, no, it shows
uh,
Biden campaign is at its essence.
yeah. But Vice is probably happy.
Well, with our piece on Vice for Moderate Rebels was about a Obama era Vice program. Forget what it was called, but it was basically narrated by Richard Haas, who is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, like the bedrock of the foreign policy establishment. And he had four young reporters who are kind of like seemingly hip and with it, going out to countries where the US seeks regime change, but was having trouble actually getting its way. And it's about, it's basically just trying to stir interest and stimulate regime change sentiment among young people for the agenda of this kind of fossilized white supremacist liberal internationalist character who just thinks the US should be able to smash up any country that's in its way. It was really the essence of Vice. What was it called? A World in Disarray. That's what it was called.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we just like tore it to shreds on Moderate Rebels, and people really weren't looking at Vice as the hipster arm of Empire. But then I feel like we helped kind of consolidate awareness.
Yeah, that was a great episode. I listened to that. It was a few years ago now already.
Yeah,
But yeah, I recommend that to anybody who's listening. It's a great episode. You can you and Ben make a really good case as to why Vice is this sort of hipster arm of the empire, and it's they had Joe Biden come visit the office, and he was sort of like carousing with the employees, and
yeah,
yeah, it's really bizarre. And like I
I
used to live in
forgot about
Brooklyn
that.
for 10 years. I used to live in Brooklyn for 10 years, and like occasionally I'd go to Williamsburg and walk past uh, where their office was initially, and now they have a new one that's even more fancy, like right next to the Williamsburg Bridge.
It's
But
crazy. It's like this giant. I walked in there once. It's like this giant sweatshop of like, middle class gentrifiers who each have their own tiny little like cubicle style desk, just like pecking away at their Apple laptops, while some executives are off on leather couches. And it's like it's massive. It's like an airport hangar. I'm like, where is everybody in Williamsburg? Oh, they're all working in Vice's airport hangar. Like, there's nobody on the streets because they're all there.
yeah,
And it was like the
yeah,
cool. It was like the cool job in 2014 to have in media. And then you just saw all of these like frauds who went through Occupy, and these tatted up frauds who like like look and present hipster, but like inside they basically are like the Atlantic Council has hijacked their brain, and they all came through Vice. Like so many of them came through Vice.
Yeah, yeah. I used to see a bunch of them walking around Brooklyn, um, and yeah, as you often say, they just look like schmagagis. So, um,
That's you got to know some Yiddishkeit to get that one, but
yeah, yeah. Um, but all right, yeah, I don't want to take up uh, too much more of your time. So, if you want to end it there, that's cool. My guest for this episode was Max Blumenthal, founder and senior editor of The Gray Zone, which you can read at thegrayzone.com. His newest book is The Management of Savagery, which I have right here. Going to plug that again. Everybody should read that. And he is also the host of the Moderate Rebels podcast, which usually weekly, kind of bi-weekly. Um, and also with the journalist Dan Cohen, he co-made the film Killing Gaza. His latest piece is up at the Chicago Reader. I believe it's the chicagoreader.com. Max, thank you so much, man. I appreciate
yeah,
it.
thanks for having me.
All right. Talk soon.